I'll jump right in as they join. So for those of you that I have not met yet, I'm Ambika Nigam. I'm the founder of Zeit. We are a platform that helps people switch industries and roles based on their transferable skills. Really excited to have one of my good friends and old colleagues from Bloomberg Media days here, Pavan Kulkarni, who is currently a senior engineering manager at Dropbox. And I'm going to let Pavan introduce himself, but just before then, I wanted to remind everybody kind of at the topic at hand today, because it was a really popular one, it seems, and it's really how to talk technical when you're not technical. For those of you just joining, feel free to drop in your names and your background and why you joined today's chat. We really wanted to, as a founder of Zeit, I hear a lot about, I'm really insecure about the fact that I've never worked with engineers, and or I'm trying to interview for this new job and I keep getting dinged because I don't know how to work with engineers. So I thought this was a really important topic to really just demystify what it's like to work with really talented engineers like Pavan, illuminate what a day in the life is like, and really hope that today you all walk out with some frameworks and some tips on how to successfully collaborate with engineers, as well as how to communicate in your existing experience some of technical work that you've already done, and potentially how to frame it in a way that really resonates and demonstrates that you can work with engineers. So I will turn it over to Pavan to introduce himself, and then we just have a series of different topics that we're going to stalk through today, and I'll then open it up for a Q&A. So Pavan, please introduce us, give us a little bit of background on you.
Sure. Thank you, Ambika, for having me. Happy to be here and sharing my story with you all. Thank you for all the time you have taken this morning. Excited to be talking to you all. Currently, I'm a senior engineering manager at Dropbox. I'm responsible for product infrastructure teams, building a lot of infrastructure for user-facing products. So prior to this, I was at Facebook working on their enterprise marketing solutions. Prior to that, I spent a lot of time in Bloomberg Media, working closely with Ambika at that time. And then during Bloomberg days, I worked a lot with very cross-functional teams, which included customer success, marketing, sales, ad trafficking, a lot of journalists from the newsroom, a lot of product designers and product managers. So a very broad exposure there. So it was a great learning experience for me. Prior to that, I mostly worked as a software engineer. That was my day job. And then prior to that, I dabbled a little bit in starting my own company. So a little bit of entrepreneurship there as well. So that's kind of my professional story.
That's great. A lot of a good Swiss Army knife of skills you have. And as I've said to you, one of the brightest engineers I've worked with, and I think just a great person to talk about the topic at hand today. So we'll dive right in. And one just small logistical thing, feel free to drop questions into the chat throughout, and I will monitor them, and then we'll certainly get to them towards the end. But the way we wanted to kind of frame today is thinking a little bit around the product development journey. And there's different stages to how you determine what product you're developing and then ultimately execute it and get it out the door. So I thought this would be a good way, Pavan, for us to talk a little bit about how to talk technical and share some specific experiences. So kind of two areas I wanted to start with was focusing on the problem, not the solution, or the opportunity. So this is when you're developing something new, this tends to be where you start with the product brief. Would love your thoughts around what this stage looks like, what it means to focus on the problem and the opportunity and not the solution. And if you have any specific experiences at Dropbox or at our time together that you wanted to share to just kind of define this.
Sure, yeah. I think I would say the job of engineering is to actually build systems that actually build products. So in a way, our work ends up being a little bit meta. And when you're working with, I think, as a product manager with end users, it's oftentimes very easy to get sucked into the specific problem and then trying to come up with a solution yourself as a product manager. And oftentimes, one of the failure modes I have seen is when product managers or non-technical user comes to engineering and say, this is exactly what I want to be the solution.
Yep.
What ends up happening in that thing is software engineers tend to have a systems thinking mindset. We think in systems and patterns, and we are trying to build one solution. Oftentimes, a good engineer is lazy. So we want to build one solution that is for 10 problems instead of 10 solutions for 10 problems. I think stating what exactly is the problem you're trying to solve is a good way to start the conversation. For example, let's say you work in a newsroom, or some of you talked about being in consulting, right? So before offering the solution, you need to state the problem and then state why it's important to fix it. And I would say start there and make it a conversation.
Yeah, that's great. And I mean, I know in our example too of working together, just, in developing an app or working on the website, do you have certain examples, and I too will bring some to the table here, of what it means to state a problem, like from a user's perspective? Like what's a good example?
I think I'll give an example of what happened at Bloomberg. So I think so for example, if you come to us with saying, hey, I want to build a website for news, I think the type of problem or the way we solve that problem might be very different from, instead of saying, hey, I want a WordPress site or a Wix site, those type of things. So the second one is an anti-pattern. So you're bringing me a solution and you're asking me to implement it. That works well if you're paying somebody by the hour, and if you're just going to like a site where they basically give you coding services or a cost. Whereas if you're working with in-house engineers or potential engineering as your partner, they might come up with clever solutions which might actually put you on a better path. So for example, let's say this same news website option. If you are able to tell the engineer that, hey, I want this to be able to support 100 journalists being able to write their stories at the same time, the kind of choices we make will be very different. Or if you said, I don't expect this to be, for example, frequently edited, we will publish it once and then people will mostly read. Moving on from there, then the type of systems and hence the cost of building that system will be very different from something like, let's say, a Twitter or a Facebook type of system where people need to be constantly able to comment. So the infrastructure needs are going to be very different. And oftentimes, telling us the problem you're trying to solve will help us identify what's the most cost-effective way to solve that problem.
Right. Yeah. That's great. I love that example too, because I think it's a great reframe around a problem specifically. And I think the way you talked about how engineers think, I think is in a systemic way, is very important, because that is the complementary skill that you bring, right, to someone that's in product or design or in research or in customer success. And you have all of these tools that can really unlock how to solve that problem at a greater scale. And I think that is really the beauty of collaborating across disciplines, or ways that individuals can work with engineers, is to really unlock all of the solutions at that scale.
Right.
One of the other kind of moving into another section of, as you go along the product development process, which is if you've identified a problem, right, and how another way to motivate engineers is grounding that in facts and data.
Yep.
And I'm just curious to get examples around how you've seen that done well.
Sure.
And also why that's important, how that kind of unlocks ideas for engineers, given the way they think.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that's a great question. One example that comes to my mind is engineers actually want to solve problems that help business. We are extremely motivated when we are able to either reduce the pain points for our users, or we are able to help generate additional revenue. So we want to be basically the force multiplier for either reducing the pain or increasing the revenue, or saving cost and improving the bottom line. Any data that helps us substantiate those claims will actually get us very motivated. Then we can work with, for example, analytics or even the product managers to identify what are the leading indicators to make sure that we are moving the needle in the right direction. And then also also, I think, based on the impact that it's going to drive. So impact is basically the fancy word to say how much benefit you're going to give for the
Yeah.
problem you're trying to solve. Um, Again, we can make trade-offs on how to design that solution. So for example, again, during Bloomberg days, we had a couple of really big advertising campaigns, 7 figures, and they needed to be launched only within a couple of days. In the normal course, if somebody came up to us and then said, "Hey, we need to launch something in 2 days," we would have said, "Wait for 2 months." When the product manager was able to actually tell us a compelling story on why this was important for the advertising relationship and the amount of money it would make, and why it would in the long term actually help us build a more sustainable model for launching these type of things, it actually motivated myself and my team, and we were able to actually quickly throw in a prototype together that was just good enough to be launched for that campaign. And then we were able to successfully not just launch the feature, but we were actually able to strengthen that relationship with those 2 big marquee customers.
Yeah.
So that's an example of where data, if used well, will actually help you get something you wouldn't have gotten in a short period of time. Plus also in that example, knowing that only 1 or 2 people are going to use it, or 1 or 2 advertisers are going to use this, helped us take some shortcuts which we wouldn't otherwise from a system design principle point of view. So for example, as an engineer, I'm always thinking about security, reliability, and I carry the pager. So am I going to be woken up in the middle of the night? So that's why oftentimes when engineers say that I need time to implement this, they are kind of thinking of that kind of not just the tip of the iceberg, but what actually makes it kind of show up above the water. And most of the people don't realize that there is so much going on behind the scenes. And that is the cost of engineering. So if you were telling me that this is one-off, and then I might be able to put together a quick solution versus if you say that we expect 1 million people to use it, I will need to think about it a little bit differently. So
Right.
that's what really helps. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great point, great example, and a good point in terms of thinking about audience size as something that can definitely impact how an engineer chooses to execute something.
Yeah.
You also just reminded me of something that you and I have talked a lot about, which is trade-offs.
Yeah.
And I think this is a good step to address this. How do you think about trade-offs, and especially in that example that you just shared, how big of a piece of your process and thinking is that, the idea of making trade-offs?
Sure. One of my favorite things is engineering is all about trade-off all the time, and product managers often are the partners that bring data from the customer side and the business side, and we bring in the data from engineering side and execution side. So that's why I feel like both product managers and engineers in general need to be very grounded in being able to make those trade-offs. So in that previous example of the ad revenue instance, I think one is the factors we consider in making that trade-off was how often is this feature going to be used? If it's going to be used every day by everybody in the newsroom or advertising team, then we need to make sure it fulfills everybody's need, which means the design is going to be more complicated.
Right.
Whereas if this was 1 campaign or 2 campaigns and only 1 person is going to be using it, then we can work with that person, we can have a clunkier workflow, and then they can just get it done. That's one part of the trade-off. The second one is whenever you introduce new degrees of freedom within our engineering systems, it's going to introduce new vulnerabilities. It could be security vulnerability, it could be operational vulnerability, or it could be what we call as tech debt, which is basically somebody having to constantly keep an eye on it if things do go wrong. So establishing bounds of that will help us understand which are the right trade-offs to make. So that's one part. Then in this example, this was not so much the case, but when oftentimes we work on projects that are slightly longer duration, maybe 6 to 12 weeks, like 3 months, let's say, and sometimes they're even longer than that, right? 6 to 12 months. And one of the kind of trinities in project management is you have a scope, you have project scope as in the requirements scope, then there is the budget, and then there is the budget count, kind of means how many people can you add to the project, the headcount, the tools, consulting, the dollars that you can bring in. The third one is the timeline. So how much time do you have to build it? So constantly, whoever is doing any project, whether it's software engineering or otherwise, we are constantly thinking about the trade-offs. So the area of the triangle is going to be fixed. You just need to figure out which one you're willing to flex. So I think understanding how to make trade-offs, and then where are you willing to cut corners, or where are you willing to give up some scope, is a great way to have productive conversations with anybody, not just engineering.
Yeah, I love that. I think the triangle is the mantra to live by for sure when working in these cross-functional teams. And such a good point. That triangle being, time, budget, and resources, as you said. And just kind of to round out this, what we were originally talking about, this ability to ground your problems or opportunities in facts and data. I think you gave a really good example of how this is motivating for engineers, right? This is really what gets them up in the morning,
Right.
to know that, wow, we can actually, add this button to the news feed of a mobile app, and it can drive this many more users into our app every day, which makes it that much more valuable. So getting them excited and using data to kind of cut through and be objective, I think is really critical. And I think also important, because that is the thing that you come back to, that data point, when you are addressing these impact, the trade-offs, right? So if this is the goal at hand, what do we need to compromise as it relates to budget, as it relates to time, as it relates to resources? And I think that advertising, example is a good one, where if that is the most immediate goal, is to get that that's those 7 figures in the door, then how do you address that triangle to meet that goal? So
Yeah.
love that. I love that idea. I'm just moving us along kind of a little bit more deeply, and we're going to get a little tactical here in the product development process. So, and I think this is kind of most common for product managers, but probably also a couple other disciplines, which is scenarios, or talking in terms of user flows and use cases. Can you tell us a little bit about what that means? So now we're assuming that you know the problem that you're solving. You have the facts and the data around why you're doing it. Now we're getting a little bit more into the nuts and bolts of what that looks like, in terms of a user flow and a use case. What does that mean? And can you share some examples of what good looks like or what bad looks like when teams communicate that to engineers?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's, again, I think a very good question. When you work in any sizable business, multiple people are going to be touching different aspects of the system. And then there will be different people who will be actually either users or customers of that system. So going back to our previous, let's say, news website example, because that's something everybody can relate to.
Yeah.
There is an aspect of content production, if you will. So somebody might be writing the story, but it doesn't end there. There is probably going to be a person who is going to be just designing those headlines that are going to be catchy, and they're going to kind of entice somebody into reading about the story. And then there may be a different person who is going to be working on how to attach the right type of creatives to the story to have the right, for example, the lead image, or maybe a video that goes with it, or the recirculation that needs to go with it. So I kind of think of it as, especially when it comes to any piece of content, think of it as a Christmas tree. Everybody's going to kind of hang their ornament to that. So you need to understand what is
Such a seasonal example there.
There you go. Yes. Yeah. So what is their motivation? And then how much time do they spend doing this? So for example, when we were building a publishing system for a business week, the editorial team actually used to work late into the night, almost until 2 a.m. every Wednesdays, when the news were actually, the magazine would go to print. So we actually measured how much pain point every person in that workflow was incurring. And then we said, here is how we can actually improve for everybody. So that's what I think the flow helps. And this goes back to my previous favorite topic of systems thinking. So when you work on any sizable project, think of this as a supply chain. And then each piece or each step in the flow is going to make some value addition to the process. How often does that value addition happen? What are the motivations of the person working on that? And is there a metric we can measure that's going to suitably suggest when we make any improvements? Because if you can't measure something, you can't improve that, or you don't know if actually
Yeah.
improved it. That's kind of how I think about it. And then sometimes there's a part of the going back to the tip of the iceberg example. There are certain pieces that the users see, but there may be other pieces that the users don't see, but engineers do, or someone else might be. I'm not claiming that
Yep.
engineers know everything, but making sure that all the people are actually involved in the process and we talk through it as a system end to end, I think actually helps identify the right bottlenecks, the right workflow. And then when it comes to time for trade-offs, you can say, you know what, this person is going to do this only 1 hour a week, and it's okay to keep that pain for them until now, until the time we can get budget or time to do that. Because going back to that Trinity, right? You may not have the resources or the time to fix everybody's problem. You need to pick which ones to live with and which ones to actually fix.
Yeah, absolutely. That's I love that example too of I remember that in the business week flow, just really being able to create a baseline for how the experience was for the editorial team today. And then understanding how developing yeah, a more technical solution was actually going to improve that, which is kind of a good segue into what goes hand in hand with use cases and user flows, as you
Mhm.
mentioned, which are metrics, business metrics. So and I think a lot of people here that are either trying to break into a new role or industry, or just started a new one, trying to define metrics can sometimes be hard, right? Like
Yeah,
figuring out the
yeah,
right metrics to move.
yeah.
And as you said so eloquently, if you don't know what you're measuring, then um, you don't know really the right solutions to build. So let's double click on that for a second. Like, what are some of those the metrics maybe from that example of Business Week that you were really looking to address? And how did you start to kind of identify solutions that you knew would then move the needle on that, based on those metrics?
Sure. Yeah. I think the identification of metrics is more of an art than a science. And then oftentimes we do think that more metrics are good, but I don't believe in that. I think you need to have maybe two, at the most three metrics that you identify for a entire program. So in this case, for example, the entire publishing system identified 2 or 3 key metrics,
Yep.
and then just try to figure out which ones of them are being able to optimize. So even in the metrics, I think you'd have to ruthlessly prioritize which ones to actually move and which ones to be okay with. And then in this, going back to the example, one of the things we wanted to kind of focus on is we wanted to reduce manual errors in the whole process, because given that the process used to go until 2 a.m., if there was a single error, it would probably push you to the next day. And then one thing you don't want to do when you're publishing a magazine is you don't want to miss your time. You don't want your magazine
Yeah.
not to be on the stand, so to speak. Even though this is all digital, people
Yep.
expect it to be there in their newsstand application at that time at a certain point in the day. So that is obviously something we cannot miss. That was one thing we tried to measure, like how much does it take from the time the editorial says we have closed our stories for the week and it's going to hit the publication stand, and then start identifying from that point onwards where is the time being spent. So budget all of the time and then see where can we move the needle. So I think that's step one we did. The step two was who are the people involved there and what is the nature of their job. For example,
Yep.
when I say that, how many different systems do they have to juggle in that high stress situation? Because the last thing we want when you're in a time crunch is people having to deal with 10 systems. So how do we reduce the number of systems they need to interact? So for example, there was a print CMS system that the print team used to use. And then somebody would go into a digital CMS system to import those stories. And then they would make sure that there is kind of like a metadata that is required to tag a story. And then there were a
Yep.
certain set of hoops to jump through to make sure that it both goes to the iOS as well as the Android stores. So how can we at least reduce part of those so that the editor can just go to one CMS, pull everything in? That becomes their kind of like a dashboard or cockpit, if you will, for the rest of the
Yep.
night. So number of systems to interact with, that was kind of the second metric. The third one would be, I don't recall it at the time. I think it was something around publishing, because we had to publish it to many millions of users. and we wanted it to be available before everybody wake up 7 a.m. the next morning or something like that. So then we used data around where is the particular user from. That way you don't have to send 7 million or 10 million blasts at the same time, but you can actually
Right.
time it based on their geography. So those are kind of three metrics plus the tactics we used to actually launch this.
That's great. I love that. I love that example so much. And there's just a couple of things here that I think are really relevant to people on the phone. Again, this topic at hand was so popular because I think there are many people that struggle with articulating their experience today and how they've actually done a lot of what you just shared, right? You know, they've quantified a process, and in terms of its productivity, in terms of its impact, and they have implemented a new product, a new service, a new experience to make that better. And sometimes it's really just being able to say, here is where we started, and here's where, you know, what we implemented actually changed that in the form of we reduced the number of calls for people that are in maybe like customer service. We made the step, we reduced the number of steps it takes to actually, you know, get to a customer. And I think what you just explained is a great way to talk about your ability to be technical, if you will, to be analytical, and sharing those stories in a way that demonstrates I can think in this way and I can't work in this way, and therefore here is exactly how I would translate that into a setting working closely with engineers. So just wanted to share that as a quick example for people that might be relevant for here today. The other thing that I just wanted to touch on is, so love how you identified the specific metrics, right, that you're looking to move in terms of streamlining a process. Now we executed the product, and how do you actually start to kind of track and assess whether or not you're moving? Can you talk a little bit about what that process looks like? Because you kind of have these hypotheses. Now you're trying to see whether or not you've actually achieved them.
Right. I think that's a fantastic question. When we identify metrics, the other one that is important is what we call as the guardrail metric. So guardrail metric is the one that you don't want to regress on. So for example, while automating all of this, if we made certain other aspect of the system or workflow worse, we want to make sure there is a way to capture that. And then ideally, you don't want to regress. So I'll give you a slightly different example to make a point. For example, let's say you're designing a system for call center application or customer support. And if we said our metric to improve or the OKR, or the key objective is to reduce the duration of the call or the time the customer representative spends with the customer. So that's a good metric to improve, because then you can say, I'm able to service 5,000 calls versus 500 calls, whatever, right? If you did 10x improvement. Right. However, if you don't have a guardrail metric that says we also want to reduce the number of callbacks for unresolved problems, then you are exchanging one problem for the other. So the reps are now doing more calls, but maybe they're coming back from the same customers who did not have the issue resolved. So that's where kind of like when you design those metrics, guardrail metrics are very important.
That's interesting. That's a great one. And how do you? What's a good way that you suggest people communicate that, or kind of ideate around that when working with engineers? Like, is that something that you always see in product briefs, or do you ask team members?
We don't actually. I wish more people thought about it. We don't, because I think oftentimes everybody, including engineers, we get excited about new things, and we don't necessarily always think about what it means for the existing features. So one thing that comes to my mind is any news media company goes through a lot of those redesigns. And every time you redesign a website or an app, you obviously want to keep up and then maybe introduce new elements to the page. For example, during my time at Bloomberg, a lot of it was around, the trend is shifting towards videos and we need to have rich media ads. And then for every brand, I think my team supported like 11 or 12 brands. Everybody had a unique font, and then their page layout needed to be different. So now if you actually think about it from a design point of view, yes, they are all actually valid asks. But then if we just said we want to measure the number of launches we are able to support or number of brands we are able to support on my platform, we are actually moving the needle in the right direction. However, going back to the Christmas tree, right? If everybody is hanging their decorations at some point in time, the tree might come down if you don't watch out for how heavy the ornaments are. So we started instituting this policy of let's also start measuring the baseline page load performance to make sure that, and obviously you have to identify there what is the useful metric to measure, because page load is such a bloated term. So in our case, we said time for first headline, because when people come to news websites, they actually want to read the headline first. So we started measuring that very specific metric as a way to, that was our guardrail metric, if you will, for
Yep.
mobile and then desktop browsers. And as long as we were within a certain budget, we would let you come up with your own design. And if the design or the choice of, let's say, video or a headline would affect, or a font would affect that, then we have to make a trade-off. Either you say, let's reuse one of the fonts we already have on the page, or you might say, let me give up something else so that I can bring this one in because this is really important to me.
That's great. That's super. It's super interesting as a, I mean, that's just a good tip, I think, for everybody here to gut check, when going through this process and thinking about these are the metrics that we're looking to move, making sure that you think about a guardrail metric to make sure that, you're not creating this leaky bucket situation, if you will.
Right.
We have, actually one quick question around guardrails that maybe we will jump into here. So I think it's Newton who says, have you experienced that guardrails are usually a metric that you bring early on, or is it more of an iterative method where you discover and learn guardrails after product has been put into place? More of a lessons learned. Yeah.
Right. I think that's a great question, Newton. I would say when the product is launched, probably guardrails is a little bit too late. Because oftentimes everybody wants to move forward. So there is not enough time or patience or budget to go back and fix things. So I obviously learned it after cutting my teeth. So oftentimes I insist that we talk about the budget or guardrail metric even before we actually start implementation. So it doesn't have to be in the PRD stage per se, but it definitely has to be once the product requirements have been finalized before it kind of gets included in the PRD. One best practice I would say is we do keep calling it PRD, but I don't think that's a very waterfall-y kind of connotation to it. So modern workplaces tend to be very collaborative. There is generally an engineer in the room while you're having this conversation from day one. So ask them about what are the things we should make sure that we don't regress on. And they will give you some hints on what those guardrail metrics could be.
That's great. That's great. So wanted to dive a little bit more deeply into, I know PRD is a very kind of one product requirement document for those of you that aren't familiar with that. But get specific around communication in the form of written and oral.
Mm-hmm.
This is quite tactical here, but when talking to engineers, as well as, I mean, the cross-functional team that needs to come together to get this product out the door, which could be customer success, engineers, designers, ad people, as you mentioned, sales. This is such a critical piece, and I'm sharing a quote that one of my other favorite engineers has said to me, which is, the way to communicate with engineers successfully is to talk in nouns and verbs. So I want to, if you can just share a little bit more about like good communication written and oral versus bad communication written and oral, that would be super helpful. And as you think about that really quickly, I'll just want to share a little bit more context behind that quote. Good people communicate engineers in nouns and verbs, which is really removing anything lofty or verbose around how something needs to get done and implemented. So what are your thoughts on kind of good oral and written communication to talk about? a product?
Yeah, I think that's a loaded question because it can take so many forms. I do just subscribe to that philosophy that it should communicate in verbs and nouns. So if you go back to the use case philosophy, so the nouns are basically the actors in the system. When I say actors, it's basically the components that make up the entire system. In the publishing example, content management system or CMS is an actor. Then the other actor could be that the digital asset management system, which has all the videos and images that you might host. And then the other actors could be any other systems you interact along the way. And sometimes even people can be actors because they cause certain activities to happen on the system. So it could be the publisher, it could be the journalist, or it could be the ad or sales person who is going to do something to that content as well. And likewise, if you talk about the customer relationship, there are going to be actors similar to that. There's a CRM system, there's probably a customer support executive. And if you're a customer success manager, you are going to be an actor. Plus, you will have a counterpart on your client team and so on. So those are the nouns. And then I think the verbs are the activity you perform on them or the effect you cause by acting on those. So by stating in verbs and nouns, you're going to say who are going to be involved, what are the activities they're going to be performing. So then I, as an engineer, can now think of a system where I can say, here are the components and these are the capabilities they need to have to support those verbs or actions. So I think that's how I think about it. A good example might be that and this kind of boils down to if you have a little bit of tactical advice here. So if you follow Agile or if you have read about Agile, a typical way you write a user story is as an editor, I want to be able to write a story so that I can, or rather, I want to be able to write something so that I can tell my story. So here, actor is I as a writer or a journalist, activity is being able to write the story. And then so that is basically the impact I intend to have. So that's kind of baked into the whole Agile process. Now you can make it into a single task, or you can make it into a project definition that could be called an epic, or you can even bubble down and bubble up and call it as the whole PRD is about that.
That's great. I love that. I like the breakdown there of the nouns and verbs, and I think that's a very creative way to talk about it. I wanted to open it up to questions here because I know we have about 15, 20 minutes left. So definitely feel free to drop them in the chat, or if you're brave enough to get on the video, we'd love to see you and have you introduce yourself to Pavan. And as people think about that, one of the things I just wanted to do a little bit of kind of like a rapid fire with you is think about some of the different disciplines and kind of what does it take, what does it take to have a really good kind of cross-functional relationship. So you can just humor me here and think a little bit about like filling in the blanks. Like what does it take to have, for an engineer and a product manager, to have a really great relationship?
Lots of coffee. I mean, what I mean is, I don't mean to be cheesy about it, but I think nothing substitutes in personal relationships. So I think the most successful professional relationships are the one where I have actually spent a ton of time in cultivating those and understanding their point of view. I think and me and you were together as well. So there were a lot of contentious topics where we did not agree on that. But at the end of the day, we both knew where we are coming from. So I think having that level of relationship is important. So invest time as you build your career in understanding. There may be one or two people within engineering who will be, who you might feel comfortable talking to, or who might see your point of view on that one. So start talking to them. Don't be afraid. And then also, I think a lot of senior engineering managers actually want to hear from product managers. So don't be shy, set up coffee or get that time on their calendar. Go talk to them. They can also be your career advisors in the long term. And then I would say, learn a little bit about the technology space that you're going to be working on. If you are going to be in the web space, understand where things are heading from a browser point of view. What are the emerging technologies? If you're going to be in the apps space, understand where Apple or Google are taking the technology space. What are the kind of choices and trade-offs you can make. And if you're going to be in other spaces as well, understand where the kind of trends are. So I would say the best product managers I have worked with, they actually understand how engineers are going to build the thing that they're asking them to build. So that way there is
Yeah.
greater empathy. The worst thing you can do is trivialize someone else's work to say that, hey, why is it going to take you 6 months? Because it's just a bunch of HTML and CSS. That is the worst kind of
Yeah.
conversation you can have.
Yeah. That's a great, I mean, I think that's a good distinction here is the empathy piece, like, and having a curiosity for the technical aptitude and detail that goes into developing something. And this is an area that's obviously near and dear to, I think, people here is you don't need to necessarily know how to code, right? But you need to have an understanding of the trends and the potential systems that could aid or facilitate, a solution for an engineer, to be a good partner to them.
Yeah.
Um,
And
and do
just
you,
what,
yeah,
sorry.
no, go ahead.
Sorry to interject. I think one quick point that I remember is it wasn't that when I say empathy, I don't mean say yes to everything the engineer says. Some of my product managers were quite difficult to work with. They would challenge me, but in a good way. One way to kind of understand a little bit more and challenge the engineers might be that help me understand why it is going to take 6 months or 3 months. Do you think
Right.
there's a way to make it happen in 2 weeks or 3 weeks? So that's a good conversation to call out those trade-offs. Maybe you didn't know something, or they made some assumptions about how robust the system needs to be. So that way it becomes a conversation, not a confrontation.
Right. I love that. I think that's a really, really good point, is getting into the details behind those assumptions, to make for a better working relationship, and really, and for someone who might not even have some of the technical aptitude to really start to build it and understand and get educated as to, okay, here's why they were thinking that it was going to be taking 3 months.
That, or you might actually make me, the engineer, learn a little bit more, because this is some of the things that my product managers did to me. Like, the more frequently they challenged, I started their way of seeing their way of thinking and say, like, what can I do to actually make that true? Because I,
Right.
as an engineer, I'm motivated by solving problems, right? So if you constantly ask me the same thing, now you're going to motivate me to solve it for you. So that's one way to
Right.
also have your influence.
Yeah, that's a great one. And one quick question I wanted to kind of go full circle here is, how do you gut check that? I know we did this a lot at Bloomberg together, and having retros and looking back at our velocity around product, working together, and here's what we set out to do over the last set of sprints, or a couple weeks together, and here's what we met, and here's what we did met. Like, what are some good ways that you look back to evaluate that relationship, and making sure that it is productive?
So I think metrics help you, because if we establish our metrics well, both the top line metrics as well as the guardrail metrics, you can look at them. Again, in 3 months or 6 months, sometimes they don't tell you the story, but if you give them enough time, they tell you a story, and that's one way to check it. The second thing I would say is constantly seek feedback from the people you work with. Nothing substitutes that, because while you might spend a lot of time in identifying the objectives and metrics, sometimes people's needs change. So you need to be able to have your systems or objectives or metrics reflect that. So oftentimes the way it took a form of is every 6 months or so, I would go talk to our users and then get their feedback. And obviously, me and my product counterparts would probably talk almost every day, but at least on a bi-weekly basis, we would have a retrospective as a team. So the product managers I worked with actually came to the retrospectives my engineers used to have together. That way we could
Right.
solve the problems together as a team, instead of just saying, here is what you did wrong and here is what I'm going to do about it.
Got it. Yeah, that's great. That's great. Well, I'll open it up. Anybody on the call have any questions for Pavan? And they can be anything here. Anything we've covered in terms of product development, more details on communication or collaboration. one other question I had for you, Pavan, is thinking a little bit about. I know we touched on engineers and product managers for sure. Um, what about some of these other disciplines like customer success, like designers, and ad sales teams? Any thoughts there around what it takes to successfully collaborate with some of those different disciplines?
Sure. I think the short answer is it actually depends on the nature of these cycles. So depending on the industry you work on, the cadence might be very different. So if you're working on, let's say in healthcare, your cycle for design and interaction with sales and marketing might run into years. Whereas if you're working in the consumer space, it might run into weeks or months. So the advice might be
Yep.
different there. But one way I would say in kind of building those relationships is just like we as engineers or product managers are trying to solve a problem, they are trying to solve a problem too. Understanding what are their motivations and then what are they optimizing for. Ultimately, I think
Yeah.
when you try to solve a problem, everybody's trying to optimize for something. And we end up in arguments only because we are trying to optimize different parts of the same system. So
Yeah.
understanding that and then probably asking them out about when I say asking them out loud about what are they optimizing for will help. One tactical question I tend to ask is, if you had to pick just one thing, what is that thing you would pick in your system? That way it gives me a good signal on what is the other thing they're willing to compromise on, so that we can make
Yeah.
the conversation about those things instead of fighting on why you can't let me do this thing. I'll give an example. So I think going back to that design and fonts and page with Christmas tree example,
Yeah.
oftentimes my arguments would end up with the design team on why are you making me put 15 fonts on this one page? And in those cases, having product managers see my point of view and then actually substantiating that with saying, you know what, every time a page load slows down, this is the ad revenue impact we are going to have, and this is the negative impact on the user engagement. It helped drive home the point. And then they
Yeah.
became my partners on, hey, this is what our users are asking for in terms of like visual differentiation. But I also understand, and here is another trick to accomplish that. Maybe we'll introduce a color instead of a font, or maybe we
Yeah.
will introduce some visual elements to kind of get that going. So that's one way. Talking about customer success or customer sorry, closer to CX basically, customer
Yeah.
experience. I think working with them here at Dropbox and then previously at Bloomberg as well, I think oftentimes good CX engineers or CX representatives have intuition on which are the problems worth solving and which are the type of problems you cannot really solve. So what I found useful is actually talking to the CX representatives within the company on saying, what is the level of pain point? Is it worth solving? And then taking it to the engineering teams or rest of the team members solving that, or rather focusing on solving that. Um,
Yeah.
and then I think for sales and marketing, they tend to be very close to the customer. So I would caution that don't get too excited. Sales and marketing often tend to be very charismatic by the nature of their jobs and personality. They also tend to be loud because they're closer to the customers. That's where you as a product manager need to be the buffer. If you get yanked by just one of these, like either CX or sales or users, you're not going to be a successful product manager. So try to always take all viewpoints, but have your own sense of prioritization, and then build those relationships so that you can push back if you need to. You're not if you're just a traffic cop for all the requests coming in, then you're not going to be a successful product manager. You need to have your own point of view and you need to act as a filter.
That's great. That is sound advice. We got a couple questions here, Pavan, in our final few minutes. Actually, starting with Nuthan. So, how do engineers feel about product managers who are technical and can quickly create wireframes or no-code demos? Does it make the relationship better, or does it feel too micromanaging?
I think it depends on the relationship between the team and the product manager. I have worked with both. So definitely I have enjoyed working with people who are able to do some of them. But I think it depends on how you present it. So if you present it as, hey, here is how I know we should solve the problem, that's not going to go very well. If you
Yep.
say instead that, hey, let's try to build this so that we can validate this sooner than later, that's probably going to be more collaborative, and then you'll get more out of that.
That's great. We and we have one on the opposite end of the spectrum here, which is, what's your take on a less technical manager, pre-sales in parentheses, working with someone who is really super techy in a more agile environment? Like, how does this kind of impact that product ecosystem overall? So I think, what, if I'm understanding this one correctly, if you're not very technical and you are working with, responsible for working closely with an engineer, what does it kind of take to be successful there?
I think my advice there would be, the other person also needs to probably pull themselves out of the weeds a little bit. And then maybe the non-technical product manager needs to also understand and speak a little bit of their language. But oftentimes, I think it helps to reframe every time the conversation gets rabbit-holed into implementation details to say, how is it going to solve the problem? So going back to words and nouns, right? Trying to anchor on that and say, what is the verb here? What is the noun here? And what you're telling me, how is it going to affect that? And then what is the metric we can use to actually measure that it does what you're saying it does? So I think that's one good way to kind of anchor it. More tactically, when you're writing your user stories or epics, for example, make it a habit of sticking to a specific style of language, almost like a boilerplate, and then just ad-lib it with like keywords. For example, I, as a product manager, want to be able to do blah so that my user can do blah, blah, and then here is one way to measure it type of thing. So that way you have a common language, both of you to speak with.
Right, and you're keeping it objective. And I think also, as you mentioned earlier, we talked about grounding it in facts and data around how it's going to drive the business or how it could save the business money. That too keeps it objective. And a good segue to one of the last questions we have here, which I'm assuming is in the context of working with engineers. So how do you earn trust and confidence when perhaps you're not in the position of solving the problems directly yourself firsthand? How do you earn the trust of engineers and the team?
I think by definition, product managers are not going to be solving engineers' problems. So I don't think that is the ask from the position or the role. I think each position on a team adds a specific value. You need to understand what value do you bring to the table. I would say a typical manager or product manager brings to the table customer empathy. They understand and they talk to all of the users or system users that I cannot talk to. And they also talk to sales and marketing, so they understand where the market is. So again, putting back a little bit of supply and demand type of ask to this to kind of make a point. So a product manager needs to understand what is the demand side. So that's what our users are asking for. And then based on the numbers or talking to the finance or whoever that brings in the money, understanding what is the revenue at risk here, or what is the growth opportunity at risk here. So I think that is the value my product manager brings. And then on the supply side, they understand what the limitations of my team are. So when they represent my team in those conversations, they're able to help those actual internal users or customers make those trade-offs or kind of help us make those prioritization decisions. So that's where you actually act as a filter, right? So I would say I really respect a product manager who is able to actually get me requirements and then give me in a prioritized order and then say, here is why we are going to do it in this way. I think that's a good successful relationship. I don't expect my product manager to be able to say, use Swift or use Android Studio or use React or use this new jQuery library or whatever. I don't need my product manager to tell me that. What I need to tell them is, if you have 3 months, we need to build this. If you have only 1 month, here is what you can build and I will be able to take it back. Or if you only have one engineer, this is what we can do. And then here is why, and here is why it's most impactful. So,
I love that. I think that's actually a great place to land, given the topic here, because you really just framed and kind of brought us full circle as to how you don't expect people to come to you and really specify the technology or the coding language that you're going to use, you should be using, but more so the why. and the priority and the impact of what you were trying to accomplish. And that is, I think, really what it takes to be successful in working with engineers or even more kind of technically minded folks. So I want to just turn it over to you to see if you have any parting thoughts for this group of people that perhaps just broke into working closely with engineers or are looking to break in. And then I will kind of just wrap things up for everybody here.
Absolutely, yeah. I think one is I wish everybody good luck in the journey. I think product management is an exciting role. Even those of us who are not in product managers oftentimes wear product managers hat. So we probably understand or have empathy for your role more than you understand, more than you might probably recognize. So reach out to those partners within the new teams or companies you might land in. So that is one important thing, I think. Second thing is, like I mentioned earlier, depending on the domain you are in, both build the domain expertise or understanding, and then also the technology that is used to kind of make the sausage, if you will, for that. That way, you're able to ask intelligent questions, and when you need to push back, you can respectfully push back and still understand the choices the team makes. The third one is, I think, good product managers always have backlog. They are always able to pattern match. So build a system for yourself where you're constantly tracking requirements. The worst type of product manager would be one where they go to their users or their engineers to ask for requirements, or they forget a conversation that happened. So you need to have your own personal database. That's what I call as backlog, and then try to see patterns in them. Like for example, if 10 users asked you for 10 different requirements, your value addition to that problem solving as a product manager is saying they all have this thing in common, and that's a value you pass on to the engineer so that I can only build one solution instead of 10.
Yeah, that's great. I think that's a great tip for the kind of pattern matching and doing that synthesis when you have that data, doing that synthesis to understand really the order of magnitude of the problem or the opportunity that you're bringing to an engineer. Pavan, I can't thank you enough. You're such a wealth of knowledge, and I know personally I learned so much stepping into a product role, working closely with you. So you've given so many great pearls of wisdom here, and for everybody that attended, thank you so much. I hope that you really imparted some great tips and frameworks here from one of the most talented engineers out there. I will be sending everybody a recording of this. I will also be sending everybody, we kind of broke this into different chapters today. So I'll be sending a good recap of some of those highlights in case you didn't catch them and jot them down. And I just wanted to say thank you. I hope everybody has a great holiday. We intend to make this a series, how to talk technical. So stay tuned, and we'll be sharing some more. And round of applause for Pavan. Just want to thank you again. This was awesome.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity. It was a pleasure to be here. And as always, Ambika, it was really nice talking to you about this topic.
Thank you so much. And if anybody is so inclined, I'm just gonna, if you have any quick feedback or thoughts on this talk and what was helpful and what we can do for the future ones, please feel free to take a minute to fill that out. But with that, I will just bid everyone adieu and say thank you. Thank you again to Pavan, and hope to see you all at some of our future events.
Thank you, and happy holidays. Bye.
Bye, happy holidays.